1997, Apple was no longer the company changing the future. It was losing money, losing customers, and running out of reasons to exist. Then Steve Jobs returned and made a decision that shocked the company.
Part 1. The company that had lost its identity.
By the mid-1990s, Apple still carried one of the most recognizable brands in personal computing. But brand recognition wasn't what the business needed anymore. The company that had introduced the Mac in 1984 now seemed confused, sluggish, and a little obsolete. Microsoft Windows was improving rapidly. There was an enormous software library to go with computers sold by a dozen different manufacturers, many of them for cheaper prices than an Apple Mac would cost. Apple was fighting the advancing legions with a lineup of machines so baffling, even employees had a hard time explaining them. There were Performas and Quadras, PowerBooks and PowerMacs, and several versions of almost indistinguishable devices for home use, business, and schools. Apple executives had conflated choice with strategy. But all these models, most of which were difficult to differentiate from one another on features, price, or branding, added up to a company that was lost and couldn't answer the most fundamental question of all. What was Apple? Its financial figures bore this out. Sales were falling, Macintosh units were disappearing, and the company was logging substantial losses. It looked at new ways to grow the Macintosh. Maybe, executives reasoned, if other computer makers were allowed to use Apple's operating system, the Mac installed base would grow considerably. But this didn't turn out as well as executives thought. Microsoft licensed its operating system but still depended for profits primarily on software sales. Apple had to sell hardware to survive, and licensing to clone manufacturers resulted in the other companies cherry-picking Apple's most profitable markets and making their own computers based on Apple software at lower price points. Apple lost its grip not just on its operating system, but on its identity. In the midst of all this disarray, Apple began a desperate hunt for a new operating system. While several of the company's engineers worked to find a solution, none did. Finally, the board looked to one of Apple's prodigal sons, Steve Jobs, who had left the company years before to start a new computer company called Next. In December 1996, Apple agreed to acquire Next. Formally, the company was buying the Next software platform, which offered modern capabilities missing in the dated Mac OS. But in a broader sense, Apple was buying back its founder. At first, Jobs returned as an advisor. He didn't have a fancy title yet, didn't need one. He began surveying the business, questioning employees, and identifying the drain that he felt was siphoning Apple's life. Most were expecting him to propose a new strategy. What Jobs intended to do was throw out the old strategy altogether.
Part 2. Steve Jobs returns with a knife.
Apple's chief executive, Gil Amelio, was ousted from his position in July 1997. Steve Jobs became increasingly the king of the hill and was eventually made interim chief executive. While interim might suggest a short-lived state of affairs, it wasn't in Jobs' case. He immediately started dissecting Apple's product range. Jobs began by calling product teams into meetings to explain what they were developing and demanding a direct response. Who were they making it for? Why did they need it? How was it better than the alternatives? Too often the answers were nebulous, involving descriptions of features, market segments, or charts. Jobs could only see confusion. During a product strategy meeting, reportedly driven to frustration, he drew a large box on the whiteboard and split it into 4 compartments by dividing the box vertically and horizontally. He wrote consumer and professional across the top, and desktop and portable down the side. This is our product strategy. There will be a consumer desktop, a consumer portable, a professional desktop, and a professional portable, Jobs declared. Everything else has to prove its value. This was the ruthless decision that lay at the heart of the company's revival. Jobs was not asking, how can we improve every project? Instead, he was asking, what shouldn't we be doing? Hundreds of products, ideas, projects, and experiments were canceled or scaled back. The Newton device was axed. Many different Mac models were scrapped. Printer products and others were shelved. Apple stopped licensing its manufacturing technology to clone vendors. The number of suppliers was cut back, and the firm started simplifying its supply chain and manufacturing process. These cuts were painful, some for very good reason. Entire teams felt that the products they were building were the future of Apple and were deeply hurt by being cancelled. Some believed the pruning was an indication of how careless the company had become about its creative culture. But Apple did not have too little creativity. It had too much, it was too diffuse and was not concentrated into the few things that truly mattered. Every single project and product, whether it was a product in the pipeline, an experiment in a laboratory, or a license that the company granted to a manufacturer of clone Macintoshes, consumed expensive engineering talent, sales and marketing budgets, factory capacity, executive attention, and cashed out. A firm with bottomless resources may be able to survive such a proliferation of projects, but Apple in 1997 did not have such resources. Instead, it had to place a small number of big bets and ensure they were the best of the lot. Jobs understood that focus wasn't just about deciding what to build. Focus was about accepting the personal, professional, and financial cost of not building anything else, of accepting the anger, frustration, and loss of opportunity that comes from rejecting 95% of the opportunities that come your way. The cuts were also sending a message. Apple would no longer be measuring its success by how many products it sold. Instead, it would be judging itself on how many products it got exactly right. Whereas the old Apple had tried to offer a product that the customer might need, the new Apple would attempt to understand the needs of its customers before those customers arrived in the store. Jobs was narrowing the field. He was cutting the choices. But for the first time in many years, he was making its purpose apparent.
Part 3. The deal with the enemy.
Trimming some products could help stem the losses. But it could not fix Apple's most perilous problem. Confidence was waning. Customers worried Apple might not live long enough to service the computers they'd already bought. Developers wondered whether building Mac applications was worth the effort. Retailers feared stocking goods from a company that looked to be dying. Even fiercely loyal Mac users began mentally preparing for their platform's demise. Apple needed more than money. It needed public evidence that the Macintosh still had a future. On August 6, 1997, Steve Jobs walked on stage at Macworld Boston. Apple's fans anticipated an announcement of a triumphant new era of independence. Instead, Jobs gave them the opposite. He revealed a landmark deal with Microsoft. For years, Apple loyalists had viewed Microsoft as the enemy. The two companies had engaged in bitter battles over graphical user interfaces, operating systems, and the very future of personal computing, with Microsoft's Windows increasingly establishing itself as the world's dominant PC operating system. Now Jobs invited that enemy onto the stage. Under terms of the pact, Microsoft would continue to develop Office for the Mac for 5 years, would invest $150 million in non-voting Apple stock, and the two companies would resolve long-standing patent disputes. Apple also agreed to make Internet Explorer Microsoft's default web browser for the Mac, though other browsers could still be installed. Then a giant image of Bill Gates flashed above the stage via a live satellite feed. "Get out," some members of the audience booed. "Microsoft's out. Microsoft's out," other people shouted. From their perspective, it looked like a humiliating surrender. Jobs saw it differently. Apple didn't need Microsoft to lose. It needed to survive. The old rivalry, he believed, was now a distraction. A Mac without Office would be significantly less appealing for school systems, businesses, and home users alike. Developers needed to see assurances that major software providers still viewed the platform as a viable prospect, while investors needed proof Apple was not an isolated pariah. Above all, Apple needed time and cash. The $150 million wasn't nearly enough to rescue a company of Apple's size, but the pact's true value was symbolic. The dominant player in the computer industry, Microsoft, had implicitly bet on Apple's future viability. Jobs told his audience that Apple had to transcend the idea that, for Apple to win, Microsoft has to lose. That statement signaled more than a mere business negotiation. It was a profound repudiation of the emotionally charged rhetoric that had fueled the company for years. He was willing to antagonize Apple's most fervent advocates to preserve the institution. The crowd craved a fight. Jobs required a ceasefire. The deal lessened the uncertainty surrounding the Macintosh software ecosystem and provided Apple with valuable breathing room. But even more important, it illuminated a characteristic that would define Jobs' second stint at Apple. He could fiercely love and embrace Apple's traditions, identity, and values, but he wouldn't be blinded by sentiment when it came to preserving the company itself. Anything, whether product, rivalry, or internal belief that jeopardized its survival, would be discarded.
Part 4. The computer that looked alive.
Jobs had made the company more organized and the key relationships were more stable. But Apple still needed a product that proved that this strategy would work. That product was the iMac. In the late 1990s, the computer industry was a sea of beige boxes. Most computers were designed as tools, often kept under desks with various ports, cables, and gadgets around them. Jobs' new consumer desktop was not designed to look like just another appliance. The iMac was an all-in-one computer, translucent and rounded, with its components visible behind the colorful plastic, the monitor and computer in a single casing. The computer had a friendly, strange appearance, and it was immediately recognizable. The first iMac was Bondi blue, and a handle was placed on top, suggesting that a technology product did not have to look permanent or threatening. Although led by the Johnny Ives design team, this machine was far more than just a fashion accessory. The iMac was a tangible demonstration of the new strategy. It was simple, focused, and aimed directly at a particular group of customers. The I referred to the Internet, an increasingly vital part of home computing. The company marketed the iMac as a user-friendly option for entering the Internet. But Apple had made sacrifices. There was no floppy disk drive, and the machine only used a USB port, a connector that wasn't yet common in the computer industry. Some people complained that Apple was forcing customers to abandon technology they already used, but Jobs felt those tools were a relic of the past. That was going to be another of the new Apple's characteristics. Jobs was not going to wait for every customer to be comfortable. Apple was going to abandon old technology to drive its product into the future. In May 1998, Jobs showed the iMac and compared its colorful, eye-catching design to the dull beige computers sold by Apple's competitors. That stark difference spoke for itself. Apple no longer tried to win on specs alone. It was selling an experience, an image, and emotion. Launched in August 1998, the iMac was an immediate commercial success, and it put customers back into the stores. It became widely visible in magazines, advertisements, and on television screens. Even people with no intention of buying one instantly knew what it was. Other manufacturers treated color and design as decorative elements. Apple treated appearance as part of the function. The iMac also greatly improved the company's financials. By simplifying sales to a handful of models, it could better manage marketing, manufacturing, and distribution. In short, the product became the public face that the company was back and ready to lead. The iMac did not single-handedly build Apple's future empire, but it did more than any other single thing to rekindle something crucial: belief. Employees knew their work was valuable, developers could count on a market for their products, retailers knew that they could generate buzz and excitement. Consumers were reassured that buying a Macintosh was not a speculative gamble. For years, Apple had justified its existence. The iMac stopped doing that. It arrived and made all of its competitors look dated.
Part 5. The real product was focus.
Apple was profitable again within a year of the first iMac shipping. Mattered. But the real change was one of strategy. Steve Jobs changed how Apple decided things. Before his return, the company viewed any new idea as potentially a new product line. Post-return, every new idea had to battle for Apple's limited attention. The question was no longer if something could make money, it was whether it deserved to be one of the few things Apple would do great. The professional and consumer lines became more distinct. The company developed Mac OS X out of technology from Next, later entered portable music players with the iPod, and built an entire iTunes ecosystem around it. Apple opened up Apple retail stores even as analysts predicted their demise, and then moved outside computers entirely with the iPhone and iPad. It is easy to assume those successes were always in the cards. They were not. In 1997, Apple had no secret blueprint for the iPhone. It had a shrinking computer business, eroding confidence, and too many priorities fighting for limited focus. It did not first predict the next hit. It first created a company that could ship one. Jobs' best decision wasn't the deal with Microsoft or the iMac, but his decision to focus Apple's remaining assets. Microsoft bought Apple a mandate and some time. The iMac gave it an icon. Focus, however, bought both moves. Focus enabled the company to align its best designers, marketers, and engineers on a handful of products. Focus simplified the product story for customers. Focus cut down on inventory, internal conflicts, and wasted development. And focus gave employees a yardstick. Could this product be good enough to justify everything Apple would not do because of it? The turnaround also highlights the uncelebrated dark side of transformation. Business stories trumpet expansion, growth, and innovation. Dying companies rarely need more of those things. They need fewer. Any organization builds a cache of good ideas that used to make sense over time, supported by someone powerful or justified by historical precedent. They keep the meetings they've always held. The strategy becomes so complicated few are willing to challenge it as it supports so many careers. Jobs did not enter Apple with the same emotional investment in the company's decisions. He acted as if the business needed to restart. In a sense it did. Thousands of companies want focus. Few pay the price. The price of focus is telling good people their project is dead. It means shedding revenue that doesn't directly serve the central purpose. It means telling customers no when they ask for the familiar product, even acknowledging that some of the bad ideas could have succeeded. Jobs bore that burden because the alternative was a slow decline of dwindling relevance. The turnaround was not a miracle, but a process. Recognize the strategy is failing, remove projects without a clear direction, preserve essential relationships and resources, focus everyone on one clear product that people understand now. Apple did not solve its crisis by growing, but by getting smaller and more disciplined. The company that later put 1,000 songs in your pocket and the internet in your phone got its start with a whiteboard and 4 empty boxes. It all began with what Steve Jobs was willing to wipe out. Welcome to the Noir ledger, where corporate empires leave a paper trail, and sometimes the greatest decision an emperor makes is not what he chooses to build, but what he finally decides to dismantle.